You know, we've been getting more and more reports about sightings of this culprit called historical revisionism. So, just a couple of extra hours at the office for me. Unpaid, of course. I'm a real bad actor, I'm sorry. Just, we'll take a look at historical revisionism, because I happen to be a historian, unironically. World War I, where it all began. In German historical science, World War I, or rather its aftermath, is often considered to be the origin of what we now call historical revisionism. The defeat in the war was a tremendous shock to the elites of the country. The German Empire had been established by the Prussians in 1871 in order to rival the might and size of the Austrian Empire. The Austrian Empire was the rivaling big power in that area. And prior to World War I, the Prussian army was revered and considered to be quite successful. This, combined with Wilhelm II being a man-child in every way, led to a certain sense of arrogance and overconfidence, which played into the defeat being such a shock. In 1918, when defeat was inevitable and masses of Germans were suffering from hunger and being tired of the war, thousands of them protested, which led to many leaders being forced to resign or having to sign reforms. This ultimately led to the abolishment of the monarchy. Now, this wasn't the first time that a call for democracy had swept through the Republic. The idea had been discussed for over 100 years, and the first democratic government on the territory was founded in 1848. During a time in which numerous revolutions swept across the entire continent. However, quite a few people were not willing to accept that, or the defeat for that matter. There must have been something else going on, something really sinister. There was no way that the people could start to think that their monarchs were unnecessary, useless or oppressive. So of course, this was the fault of the Jews. What else? The man who was most convinced of this was no one but Wilhelm II himself. After all, for what other reason could he have lost his position as the emperor? So, of course, the revolution must have been the result of a Jewish communist plot that had already sabotaged the army throughout the war. Victory was in our grasp, accounts of Friedrich Wilhelm of Prussia. Sure, dude. Even before the defeat, there was a conspiracy going around that Jews were actively sabotaging the army. And this ultimately led to a study being conducted, the so-called Judenzählung in 1916. The results of the study were kept secret, but a subsequent study by Franz Oppenheimer showed that the Jews were actually overrepresented in the army, and there was no actual evidence to call them traitors or unpatriotic. But that didn't lead to the believers of the conspiracy to change their view. Of course not. This anti-Semitism was deeply rooted in the culture and the politics of the past. It's not like everybody really loved the Jews and then did a complete 180. The TLDR is that hating Jews was more than acceptable, making them the perfect scapegoats for everything. On the 18th November of 1919, Generalsfeldmarschall Hindenburg was summoned in front of a committee that had been established by the Weimar Parliament. The task of the committee was to fully analyze the happenings of World War I and the defeat. In his testimony he stated, "Our numerous requests for strict measures and strict laws were not heeded. That way our operation had to fail. The collapse was inevitable. The revolution was only the last piece of it. An English general once rightfully said, the German army was backstabbed, killed from behind. The good core of the army is not to blame. Its accomplishments are admirable, as are that of the officer corps. Where the blame lies is clear." As I've already alluded to, this is a lie in basically every way. Masses of people were already suffering from hunger, including the military. The OHL had not only deceived the public about the real affairs of the war, but even the government. There had also been plenty of strategic failures. These are often cited as the main reasons why the war had been lost. What was remarkable about this incident of historical revisionism is that it was top-down. It was first and foremost the elites of the country that believed in it and spread it around. This was an attempt to save face in front of a public who they had been deceiving for years. Even in 1918, they had still been propagating that victory was only a little further ahead. Quite soon, the idea of the Dolchstoßlegende, or backstab legend, was widespread among anti-democrats. How it interwove leftism and the Jews, how it led to the murder of prominent Democrats and leftists, and also to the founding of the SA, would be a video topic of its own, so I'll leave it at that. World War II, the reckoning. Nazi revisionism. Probably the most widespread form of historical revisionism. You've got everything from the attack on Poland was self-defense actually, to, well, the Holocaust obviously didn't happen. The Nazis themselves engaged in it, propagating falsehoods about the past, for example, a sense of German common origin and pan-Germanism, and the present, for example, the fire of the Reichstag, in order to legitimize their actions. The term revisionist was largely used by the people who engaged in it. Prominent neo-Nazi publisher Peter Dehust published a book in 1984 with the subtitle Revisionistic Thesis of Contemporary History. What they claim to do is to revise the faulty or even wrong view of the establishment. They bring you the truth. A remarkable thing about revisionistic work in general is how decent it looks. They speak with such confidence and cite so much evidence and sources that it's really hard to see through them for lay people. They mention so many details that if you're not a World War II nerd, you probably don't really know what they're talking about. Stefan Keil, Mr. SS if you will, claims in his book 5+2 that it had actually been Poland which had ambitions to become a world power and to annexate large parts of German territory. He claims that Poland had threatened Germany as early as 1918. Now, what does he specifically mean by that? What does he mean by annexing German territory? Is he talking about the territory that Germany had lost as a result of the defeat of World War I? He's not clear. He's willingly using omission to mislead its audience without outright lying. In reality, Germany had already invaded Czech territory before Poland was attacked. Hitler and Stalin had already decided which parts of Poland would be given to whom after the conquest, and the war had been planned since 1933. What he says is obviously wrong to anyone who has the knowledge to counter it. Let's use what we've discussed so far to look at more contemporary examples. Now, even today there are many Holocaust skeptics, but I think talking about them would be useless, Because any sane person already knows they're being stupid, and anyone who believes them is already beyond my reach anyway. So instead, let's talk about the person that's actually respected by some people, Jordan Peterson. Peterson is very adamant that he studied the Nazis extensively, especially Hitler. This implies to us that he's not only on par with historians, but that he might actually know something that they don't. Or found something they might have overlooked. To him, that's, of course, the secret inner workings of Hitler. He is a psychologist after all. Exhibit A.
Well, so what do you do with the Jews and the Gypsies? Well, round them up, fine. Enslave them, fine. You don't kill them. You certainly don't devote a substantial proportion of your war resources while you're losing to accelerate the rate at which the extermination is taking place. Because that's a bit counterproductive, unless what you're aiming at is the maximum possible mayhem in the shortest period of time.
Interesting point, my dude. Except when mass extermination became a thing, the war was basically already lost, which people knew. That's why Nazi fanboy Stauffenberg et al. Attempted their assassination of Hitler. And the Germans had already enslaved so many people that maybe there was no need for more people. More people doesn't automatically mean there's more labor they can be forced to perform. He claims that if that is true, the Nazis must have another hidden motive for their actions. Well, it's not true, so his consecutive claims are necessarily wrong. Some companies, like Volkswagen, ran on 80% slave labor. Work had been used as an extermination method ever since concentration camps were erected, before the death camps were even built. Labor liberates. The Nazis enslaved the people of territories they had conquered in order to save the master race, and the people who weren't needed were exterminated. That's why there were selections on the large plazas of the camps. When they had enslaved enough Slavs, they could get rid of the lower tier humans. That's the reality of it. A recent article explored and compared Peterson's claims about the Nazi disgust with actual documents. Peterson claims they allegedly identified Jews with vermin and wanted to get rid of them, which isn't really that true either. What interests me, however, is that Peterson doesn't understand Nazi ideology in general. And the reason for that is not only that he, in reality, lacks sufficient knowledge about the Nazis, but also about German history in general. The Jewish question, or the JQ, as the cool Nazis, I guess, like to call it, had been discussed in Europe since the Jewish emancipation, and it had become a race issue already by the mid-1800s. Radical anti-Semites had already claimed for a deportation of Jews from their territory. The Nazis didn't just come up with this stuff. Anyway, Exhibit B, later in the same lecture.
And we assume that Hitler wanted to win. But that's not a very intelligent assumption. Why would you assume that? He wasn't exactly a good guy. So why should we assume that he was aiming at the good that he was promoting, even in his own terms? And so to me, there's an old psychoanalytic idea. I think this was derived by Jung. If you can't figure out what someone is doing, or why, look at the outcome and infer the motivation.
This is an insane take. That's like saying the Tenerife airport crash happened because the two pilots wanted to. It's also weirdly esoteric, which is not surprising coming from Peterson, but still. It reminds me of the whole power of the mind. Just believe in it, and it will become true. Of course, just like anything in life, it all makes perfect sense if you take a closer look. You see, you actually can't understand the Nazis if you don't understand the environment they grew up in as people. You can't understand their strategy if you don't know that Germany had struggled with two fronts in the First World War. You can't understand why they waged war and later issued the Nero Decree if you don't understand the influence of the Versailles Treaty, works like Oswald Spengler's, and the Revolution. The Jews and the leftists that had been imprisoned and killed before them were seen as people who had actively sabotaged the war. They had been actively working against the nation. They tried to destroy the Aryans. So you have this group of people that not only caused the defeat, but still actively tried to destroy your race. What do? The Second World War was, since its beginning, a war against Untermenschen. Destroying them was winning the war. In the mind of the Nazis, this war had to be won in order to ensure the survival of the race. Otherwise, they would be exterminated. All of this is ultimately what all revisionists prey upon, knowingly or not. They bet on you, not knowing better than them. They bet on you, not having read hundreds of documents that contradict their claims. But they also prey on something else, something that I like to call our desire for secret knowledge, or to know something that's forbidden or against the stream. That this secret knowledge is usually factually wrong doesn't seem to affect how we feel about it. We feel gratified by knowing something that others don't. The desire for secret or forbidden knowledge is of course not the only reason why it's actually pretty easy to fall for revisionists. I've seen so many bad history lessons. It's kinda shocking. People usually don't look at sources, they don't learn how to evaluate evidence. It's just the worst. And this is a goddess telling you that. But even if you were lucky enough to get a good education, there's still the problem that history is very vast and complex. It is impossible for one person to be knowledgeable about all of history. You either do macrohistory, where you sacrifice accuracy for a broader angle, or you do microhistory, where you focus on specific details and time periods, but sacrifice broader knowledge. Think about it. Do you at the moment know about everything that's going on in the world? Of course not. Nobody does. Another problem is working with sources. You can always find one source that claims something. If they're not contextualized through other sources, they don't mean anything. Hitler's table talk or whatever doesn't mean anything if that's the only thing you look at. You have to look at the whole picture. These three aspects constitute the axis of evil, if you will. Back in 2017, when the removal of a Robert E. Lee monument in Charlottesville was discussed, I was already a bit peeved that the issue was framed as an issue of history revisionism. However, the debate would be later overshadowed by the Unite the Right rally and the murder that took place there. But this year I was on YouTube and watching a couple of videos that were re-uploaded because they had been deleted, and in the comment section of one of those videos I saw people claiming and discussing that YouTube deleting videos is also an act of history revisionism, which ultimately led to me getting the feeling that it's something I needed to talk about. You know, I'm getting the feeling that all those claims about this and that is historical revisionism is in the end just one of those fads, you know, probably will go away when the kids learn a new word. Now, of course, all of these takes are very high IQ takes, but I do think it's worthwhile to take a closer look at the beliefs that seem to be in play in all that. Because when we talk about something that's very theoretical and abstract, such as historical scientific theory, I don't think it's enough to just point at things and say, well, this is historical revisionism. I don't think that such a surface level understanding really helps anyone. The red lining that, in my eyes, is the most apparent is the implicit belief that changing things is not only bad, but historical revisionism, which in this case is a term that makes the whole ordeal sound more serious and terrible than it actually is. Of course, when you put it like that it's just a hatred of change, it all kind of becomes pretty ludicrous. But what really is the difference between tearing down a house for whatever reason and tearing down a statue? First of all, public space or living space in general changes with the people that live in it, necessarily changes with and by the people. If nothing had ever changed, you wouldn't need detectives like me in the first place. It is this constant flux that's the premise of historical research. Statues, unlike houses or YouTube videos, only function as symbols, though. And the primary question for a historian preservation activist seemed to be whether we need those statues and symbols for our research. No, we don't. It is a normal part of change for symbols to also vanish or lose their initial meaning. When you go to a church nowadays, for example, you can donate a candle. That act has over the years become a tradition. These candle donations, however, were quite significant in the past because wax was actually very, very valuable. It was an important piece of the church being able to build its wealth. I know that, even though the symbol has lost its meaning. I also know that the Herero genocide happened, even though there are no monuments commemorating it. Not only do historians not need monuments for their research, they can't even use them as a source. Because a monument is always made after the event took place. It is a source for the reception of the original event. It says something about how we see the event, our relation to it. It says nothing about the event itself. And the same is true for all statues, really. The shaping of public space is also a tool for those in power to appeal to the public through symbols. It's not a coincidence that the vast majority of statues of historic figures in Germany were erected in the very early periods of the German Empire. These people were stylized as those German heroes and shining figures, people like Goethe, Schiller, Leibniz, Bach, and not to mention the two major faces of the empire, Bismarck and Wilhelm I, were used as symbols for German unity. Because prior to the empire, Germany had only been a culmination of various smaller kingdoms that often even hated each other. It was a tool for consolidation. Before the 19th century, monuments practically didn't exist in Europe. In other words, the nation-state and its ethnic monolith, power consolidation and centralization are historically inseparable from monuments. They do stand there for a reason. It's just not the reason that most lay people assume it is. And just like that, the Confederate statues were built in the 60s as a counter to the civil rights movement, as a symbol for black people that they will never be equal. It's not about the past. It's never about the past. It's about the present and the future. We've come full circle. Against all evidence, some people are sanctified, while others are treated as evil and unreasonable. Revisionism is often described as lying or propagating falsehood, but it's extremely important that not just any lie is an act of historical revisionism. What really makes it what it is that these lies are stated with ulterior motives. Lying about how leftists and Jews actively caused the downfall of the empire justified seeing the republic as illegitimate, and it justified concentrating and killing them at a later present. Lying about the Holocaust justifies present anti-Semitism. And lying about Hitler and his motivations justifies people who hold similar ideas but aren't as obsessed with filth and cleanliness as Peterson claims he is. Even if the direct motivation is something more personal like vanity, as seems to be the case with Wilhelm II, that still doesn't change what these actions ultimately lead to. Motives don't change that you are responsible for your actions. So, changing things is, as we've established, not an act of historical revisionism. But what about throwing things away? And to be completely honest, it's kind of hard to tell. Throwing things away is a pretty new phenomenon, at least willingly throwing things away. Books, for example, used to be so valuable that you just wouldn't throw them out for no reason. But in the end, things being lost through whatever means is the reason why I'm sitting here, why I have my job as a detective for TW Inc. And for example, I did investigate some 17th century inventories, and while of course all the objects listed on them no longer exist, I was still able to research it indirectly. And even if nothing had ever been lost in the rivers of time, we still wouldn't be able to research everything. That's just impossible. Now, I would like to dedicate a bit of time to discuss the fantastical claim that YouTube deleting a video is an act of historical revisionism. And what I think is striking about that claim is that it seems to implicitly make the statement that YouTube is an archive. But not just a regular archive where you have to ask for permission to enter it and then be declined, but an archive that's available and open to everyone anytime. Now, of course, YouTube is also an active platform, and something being an active and being in use is contradictory. After all, hoarders aren't really running private archives. It also kind of plays into the statue debate, but the internet isn't limited in the same way that space is. It's quite obvious that we can't litter entire cities with all the shitty statues ever made. But because of that, we decide what we keep and what we don't based on a nebulous cultural value. We keep things of which we say they have some kind of value for humankind. That's why certain buildings or certain structures can't be demolished, at least legally. And YouTube does actually kind of a similar thing. They seek to increase value, just not cultural value or whatever, but monetary value of their platform. But the million-dollar question is whether YouTube should do that. And, you know, as kind of a para-cop, my answer is obviously yes. Follow the law. Gotta follow the rules. Gotta enforce the rules. Law and order. You know the drill. What's also interesting about this is that new rules have to be also enforced on content of the past, because content on social media is non-linear. So it's entirely possible that YouTube changes its rules in, I don't know, 6 months, and all of a sudden creators get punished even though at the time of the content making they didn't break the rules. But that's not really something that can be solved in any shape or form. That's just kind of inherent to how the internet works, I guess. Because ultimately, YouTube's not an archive. It's a for-profit entertainment platform. Kind of similar to libraries and museums, actually. Because these institutions also have archive-like characteristics, but their main goal, their most direct goal, is to be profitable, to show things that they think will bring them money. If you see cultural value in a video, there's really no other option but to download it and keep it and collect it yourself. Gotta be a private collector on your own cost, just like with anything else, really. Whether we talk about 70s design objects, unpopular artists, or 19th century silverware and furniture, or whatever. YouTube is changed by culture, and culture is also changed by YouTube. So YouTube deleting a video might make some people sad. Just like grandma might be sad that the pond she liked to sit at as a child is now a garbage dump. Or grandpa being sad that children nowadays play video games instead of riding their bikes and cracking their skulls open. I understand the feeling. I feel that way about many things. But things change. And while that hurts sometimes, it's also what makes life worthwhile. It's definitely not revisionism either way.